Welcome to With All My Heart, a podcast hosted by Joanna Coburnett, pastor's wife at Victory Baptist Church in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. This podcast is designed to help ladies of all ages with the principles of the Word of God. In this podcast, we will explore what it means to love God with all our hearts. Through Bible lessons, we will discover how to deepen our relationship with the Lord and experience His love in a more personal way. As we journey together, let's open our hearts to the unchanging truths of God's Word.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me for another Friday of With All My Heart. And I always look forward to these times that we have together. February is flying by, and I knew that would happen. I always feel like that January is a season to itself, and then here we are almost at the end of February, and I just can't believe it. But I know before we know it, we'll be in the middle of spring. But for right now, I am enjoying our winter weather, and we are definitely getting winter this year, aren't we? But I'm loving the snow, and I'm loving all these, just the forced times of quieter times. I hope you'll plan to join us on Sunday, of course. I hope you'll be in your place here, and if you're not able to come, if you'll watch online. And then next Monday and Tuesday, I am especially excited about our revival meeting. Of course, we're going to have the Singing Rains family. They were with us for the first time last year, and what a blessing they were. I love their music. I love their style of music. But even more than that, I love their testimony, and you can just tell that they are real, genuine people. And then we're going to have Pastor and Mrs. Terry Angel that will be with us on Monday night and Tuesday night. Pastor Angel will be preaching. And I am especially very excited about having them here. I have known the Angels they were there when I was born as far as they were in my church. Pastor Angel was my dad's assistant pastor, and I have known the Angels for a lifetime. And I am excited for you to get a chance to hear him preach. And then I'm excited for you ladies to get a chance to know Mrs. Angel. And we are going to have a special podcast here airing soon that will be a question and answer time when she'll just share some thoughts and some special maybe verses or principles that have helped to guide and shape her life and to help to keep her faithful and on course as a pastor's wife, as a mother, and in the ministry. And so I'm excited to be able to share these people with you, and I hope that you will be in your place at the revival on Monday and Tuesday night. And if you're not able to be here, if you'll watch the services online, and then please plan to tune in for a very special broadcast and podcast as we get to know Mrs. Angel a little bit better. Well, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite ladies in the Bible, and of course I think I could say that about many of them. But we're going to talk about Esther, and specifically this week, and we've talked about Esther before, and I'm sure we'll talk about her again. But specifically this week, the Lord reminded me as I was reading in the book of Esther, but He brought to mind the choice that Esther made, and just all that meant for her. And I went back and I read the first few chapters of Esther again, and I really studied, and I really tried to put myself in the shoes of what it would be like to be Esther. Now, you may not do this, but I know if I'm not careful, I tend to think of the stories of the ladies in the Bible almost like fairy tales, or I see them as super spiritual giants of the faith. And you know, when in reality, they were women just like you or me, and they were used of God often during very difficult times, and yet their faith shone through. And that is the situation with Esther. You know, I think there have been stories, there have been movies, there have been books written about Esther. And often it will be described as though Esther was a Cinderella, and it's a fairy tale, and Esther became queen. But the truth is, if you read through this, you see that Esther did not have a lot of choice in the matter. I don't see where she got to choose that that's what she wanted to be. The king had commanded whenever he got rid of the former queen, and if you read that story, that was not a good situation. He had commanded for these girls to be gathered up, and then he got to take his pick. And Esther was the one that he chose. She pleased him. And so when we find Esther, we find that she was already in a difficult situation. Yes, she was in a favored situation, and she was queen. And undoubtedly, she was surrounded with luxury, and she was surrounded with many things that people would look on and say, well, I wish I had that. But that was not a life that Esther had chosen. And I see that she was in a difficult place, but then life got a lot more difficult. And you know the story as well as I, but Haman had it out for Esther's uncle Mordecai. And especially he had it out not just for Mordecai, but he had it out for the whole Jewish people. And he hated them and he wanted them killed. And when we find the story, we find that he had succeeded in getting enough of the king's ear to have a decree made that the Jewish people were going to all be killed. And we pick up the story in chapter 4 and verse number 8, when Mordecai came and he was trying to get word to Esther. And he said, Esther, I want you to know what's going on. And he sent word and he said, Esther, your people are going to be destroyed. The king has made this decree. Haman has it out for us, and your people are going to be destroyed. He said, you need to use your position to speak to the king on our behalf. And I find that Esther had a decision to make. When you read it, it says that Esther sent words back, and she said, don't you understand the law? She said, the law is that no one, including myself, can just approach the king without being summoned. And she said, if I go to him, and she said, I have not been called to come to him for 30 days, but if I go to him, I could die. And you know what? Esther had a choice to make, and Mordecai responded with this. So Uncle Mordecai had sent this message saying, Esther, you have to do something. You have to talk to the king. And Esther sent back and said, Uncle Mordecai, you don't understand. If I do this, I could die. Well, Uncle Mordecai wasn't backing down. And in verse number 13 of chapter 4, it says, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Verse number 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And so I see the determination, I see the stalwartness of Mordecai. And when Esther sent word back and said, Uncle Mordecai, I can't do that. The king will kill me. Mordecai, he stood his ground and he sent word back to Esther. And he said, I don't know how it's going to happen. But he said, God is going to deliver his people. But he said, Esther, if you don't step up, if you don't speak up, you and your father's house is going to be destroyed. And that seems a paradox to me. I don't know how Mordecai was thinking of that, because how the Jewish people would be preserved. He was confident of that. But he was warning Esther. He said, if you don't speak up here, this will be the destruction of your family and for yourself. And Esther had a choice to make. She had been able to live in the palace for a long time. And by context, I don't think it was known that she was Jewish. She had been able to live in a lap of luxury. She'd been able to live with security. But there came a point where there was a line drawn in the sand, and she had to decide if she was going to identify with the children of God, if she was going to step into the opportunity that was before her. And Mordecai, basically, he says, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And as I read that, I think Mordecai was saying to Esther, Esther, I raised you for a special purpose, and God has his hand on you. And yes, we couldn't believe it whenever you were chosen to be queen. We couldn't believe it whenever the king chose you and you've been in the palace. But Esther, is this what that was for? Is this the purpose? Is this the purpose for your life? And Mordecai was challenging Esther. Esther, will you step up? And will you take responsibility? And will you speak out for the sake of your people, for the sake of God's people, for the sake of what's right? And I see that Esther had a choice to make. And Esther said in verse number 15, it says, then bade Esther to return to Mordecai with this answer. Verse number 16, go, gather all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. And I see that Esther, she weighed her options, she looked at the choice before her, and she made the decision that she would stand up for what was right. She would identify with the children of God. She would do it no matter the cost. And she said, if I perish, I perish. And you know what? Sometimes if we're not careful, well, sometimes life just in general, it can be similar to what Esther's life was. We're sailing along and things are pretty smooth and we have the favor of people and we have life easy. But then something happens and there is a battle that is thrust upon us and there is a line drawn in the sand and we have the choice. Are we going to identify with God's people? Are we going to stand and do what God calls upon us to do, even whenever it's not fun, even when perhaps it doesn't seem fair that we are forced into this? Are we willing to say, as Esther did, if I perish, I perish? Are we willing to step over and say, whatever consequences come, I am one of His, and I am willing to do what He wants me to do? I see this. I see Esther's dedication. She first realized that the battle that she was forced into, the challenge before her, was not of the flesh, and it was not one that she could win in her own strength. And the first thing she told Mordecai, she said, you're going to have to fast and pray for me for 3 days, and me and my maids will do as well. And that's exactly what happened. She first prayed and she fasted. Let's not ever remember the source of our strength. Our sustaining power will not come from within ourselves. It can only come from the Lord. Esther, you know the story. She demonstrated wisdom. She demonstrated restraint and commitment. And we know the story how she called and she invited the king and Haman, not just to one banquet, but then to a second. And then the king said, Esther, what do you want from all this? And she stood and she said, I want my life and the life of my people. She said, for Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are to be sold, and my people to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we'd been sold for bondmen and for bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. And the king, of course, said, who is it? And how dare someone do this to you? And of course, we know it was Haman, and we know the rest of the story, how that Haman was ultimately hung on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And the Jews were able to stand and fight, and they defeated their enemies, and they said that it was a good day. But I believe that that salvation of God's people can be traced back to a woman that was thrust into a position that she never wanted. She was thrust into a battle that she did not want to fight. She was thrust into a place that she didn't want to have to stand. And she didn't want to have to face what she did face. She had the same fears that you or I did. And yet she was willing to answer the call, to answer the challenge, and to say, if I perish, I perish. You know, sometimes we're going to be put into positions that we never ask for. And I've often thought that we cannot run in the middle of the battle if we want to ultimately win the war. You know, I look back at times in my life that they were battlefields. But isn't it amazing to look back and say there is no way that I could have ever won that, or any other person in my life could have ever seen the victory? But when we see that we stayed the course, and we stayed in the fight, and we stood for what was right, isn't it amazing to step back and watch God fight for us? And so I challenge you today. I don't know what challenges are in your way today. I don't know what battles you find yourself faced with. I don't know what the Lord is asking of you. And if you feel like turning and running and hiding and not rising to the challenge, I understand that. I feel the same way. And Esther did too. Don't forget, when she first got those summons from Mordecai, she said, I can't. I will die. You don't understand. Mordecai replied back, he said, if you don't step up to this opportunity, if you don't do what the Lord has for you, you and your family will die. Perhaps he knew it was just going to be a spiritual death. I don't know. But he said, is this why you were brought to the kingdom? Is this the purpose for your life? You know, often we find the purpose for our lives in the hardest times of our lives. So let us be faithful. Whatever God puts in front of us today, let us be willing, as Esther did, to say, if I perish, I perish. Lord, if this is what you have for me, if this is what you want me to stand to do, Lord, I pray that we would say yes, and we would walk through those open doors that he gives us, and we would stand strong for the Lord. So those are just a few thoughts from the life of Esther, the choice specifically that Esther made that encouraged my heart today. And I pray that you would apply them, that you would hide them in your heart, and when you're faced with a choice like Esther, that you would be willing to stand and to move forward as Esther did. Thank you so much for joining me. I look forward to being with you again next week, and I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to With All My Heart, a ladies' devotional podcast with Joanna Coburnett. We hope that you have been encouraged and challenged to deepen your love for Christ and be more like Him today. God loves us, and we should love Him in return. Until next time, keep seeking Him with all your heart.